Hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special event. Before we begin, could you make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent? We're live streaming tonight's event as usual, so welcome to all our web viewers. A reminder that the hashtag tonight is RSA Charity, if you want to be involved in the discussion on Twitter. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's event, which is organised in partnership with New Philanthropy Capital. I'm delighted to welcome my old friend Dan Corry, who's Chief Executive of NPC. NPC was described recently in the Financial Times as having, quotes, sharp analytical and financial instincts advising charities and philanthropists, nowadays combined with think-tankery on the not-for-profit sector. Dan joined the organisation as Chief Executive in 2011 following a varied career in public policy and economics. He's been advisor to Downing Street and to the Treasury and was a director in the economics segment of FTI Consulting. Dan joins us today to explore how we can increase impact, effectiveness and productivity in the charity sector. I'm also delighted to welcome two great respondents who are going to speak after Dan's speech, Lucy de Groot, who's Chief Executive of CSV, Community Service Volunteers, and Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the CEBR, which is the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And as I say, they all respond to Dan's speech. After we hear from Dan, I'll be inviting Lucy and Vicky to join us on stage. And also, as a special bonus tonight, I hope you'll stay on afterwards to continue the discussion, because we are delighted to be having a drinks reception, which has been generously sponsored by Odgers Bernston. So please do stay on and carry on the conversation. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Corry.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Imagine you have a sector with an annual income of £60 billion, and nobody really knows what it achieves or scrutinises it very much. And then imagine it is made up of 160,000 registered bodies, many enjoying rather handy tax breaks, who are equally under-scrutinised and employ over 700,000 people. You might be a bit taken aback. Well, this is, broadly speaking, the charity sector. And this evening, I want to talk about why it is left so much to its own devices and whether there is anything we can do about it, drawing on the way things work in the private and the public sector. And I'll touch on perhaps a more controversial topic, which is whether we should do anything about that. Now, everyone involved in the not-for-profit or charity sector is driven by a sense of mission and passion. That is what makes it such an exciting and worthwhile place to be. We all give money to charity for the same reason. We want to do good. We donate the proceeds of our company, now sold as we go into retirement, or money from our family inheritance. We give a £5 by standing order once a month, or sign up for a sponsored cycle ride. We need not do it. A similar thing applies to those setting up or working for charities and voluntary groups. Many could be doing something else, or enjoying more leisure time, or getting paid better in public or private sector job. Yes, many in the voluntary sector get paid, which some diehards feel lets the side down. But very few are involved to maximise profits, improve share prices, or earn as much as they can. Now, of course, this is not the story everywhere. There are those who give to increase their chances of meeting Prince Charles or to get a knighthood, those who are corrupt or looking for tax advantages, and those who run what I increasingly call business charities, where social purpose is one among other objectives. But these are the exceptions. For most, it is about passion, mission, and doing good. And what fantastic motivations. But good motives do not guarantee good outcomes, let alone as much good as you could achieve. So when people say we should leave charities to it, satisfied by their objectives and their selflessness, and stop analysing them, I just cannot agree. Yes, we should admire charities for their dedication, but I don't think we should be happy with simply meaning well. It does not cut it. Let me propose instead that we need some creative destruction in the charity sector. There is some complacency out there, as I will go on to outline, just as there is some very good practice. If we want to identify one from the other and to encourage one over the other, then things are well overdue a shake-up. Charities seldom think about how effective they are at turning charitable funding and donated time into social outcomes. They are not generally under pressure from funders to start doing so either, but this is surely what they are all about. And the way they achieve this is broadly through what other sectors call productivity. Yet you rarely, if ever, hear this phrase used. It is little more than a four-letter word, as though sacrilegious to the very ethos of what it is to be involved in charities. Yet productivity and its close cousin, innovation, are crucially important. These two things are about using resources in the best way possible. The alternative is to accept achieving weaker outcomes for the people and causes you care about. And this needs to be dynamic too. We don't just want every charity doing the best it can with the way it works today. We also want innovation. This means constantly searching for new and better ways of, for example, organising the back office or delivering interventions or using social media for mentoring or apps to help increase knowledge about constitutional rights in developing countries. So what is holding the charity sector back? Well, while passion and a fantastic sense of mission do drive activity, this is also an impediment to doing our very best at both the level of individual charities and for the sector as a whole. The desire to give and do often overwhelms the desire to achieve and constantly improve. But many other factors also play a part and hinder the creative destruction that is needed. I will focus on 6 today: funding, feedback loops, competition, governance, measurement and collaboration. First is the constant search for funding, the obsession of every charity chief exec. This ought to put an onus on charities to prove they do their job well. However, in practice, it mainly seems to drive innovation in fundraising techniques. As former Shell Foundation and Institute for Philanthropy boss Kurt Hoffman recently put it, when the best and brightest working in the charity sector are spending so much time fundraising, this happens at the expense of devoting conscious effort to innovating and improving performance, which is by far the most important source of value creation in every other product sector in our economy. But the problem on the funding sector side goes further. Since most private, voluntary sector funders are not really trying to maximise return, in this case social return, for a given level of resources. They do want to have a positive social return and may undertake brief checks to ensure money is not being totally wasted, sequestered, or otherwise causing harm. But this is very different from searching out the most efficient organisations or innovative parts of the sector and putting money there. So there is limited pressure on charities from investors looking to invest in the best. Charities also suffer because of the tightness of the funding they receive and the fact that much is restricted to particular uses. Donors unhelpfully look at metrics to do with the percentage of money going straight to the beneficiary, which militates against longer-term developments. All this restrains charities from having the capacity to think about productivity and innovation. The funding regime contributes to a second problem of weak feedback loops from funder to charity and vice versa, as well as between charities and their beneficiaries. Think of it like this. In most walks of life, you know pretty well if your performance is not up to scratch. The guy selling coffee for £3 a throw soon feels the power of a feedback loop when his customers report that his coffee tastes horrible and take their custom elsewhere. And his investors pull out because he is losing trade and money. For charities, the person who pays isn't the person who consumes. And charitable funders rarely move their funding because the charity is not doing as good a job as another. All this means that if we think of the charity sector as a system, there are no feedback loops driving us in the right direction. There is no invisible hand of market forces where beneficiaries go to a competitor if unhappy or funders support a clearly better charity to help calibrate the system in real time towards improving productivity and innovation. Nor does it happen as a result of citizens and users saying what they think very clearly and publicly, as they might in the public sector. With honourable exceptions, and despite the best efforts of many great charities, voice, not very powerful in the public sector, is often extremely faint in the charity world, especially important when the client can't really go anywhere else. In the absence of all this, charities focus on working out what the funder wants so as to guarantee their own survival, taking attention away from what they are achieving and what their beneficiaries need and want. We at MPC often hear from charities about funders giving in haphazard ways, asking for slightly different information to another funder for no good reason, not giving enough certainty on future funding, and so on. But this rarely reaches the ears of funders because charities are keen to maintain their support. As Stanford University's Rob Reich puts it, people who become foundation officers are often surprised to find themselves transformed into the smartest and best-looking people in a room. This contributes to a third problem for the sector: too many entrances and not enough exits. The process of new charities starting up and others closing their doors does not work well in the sector. And when it does happen, it is not clear that the worst are replaced by new, better charities. Why do too few charities exit? Because it is possible to continue even if things are not going that well. As Professor Kimberly Scharf of Warwick University points out, although people start charities to solve a particular problem, they tend to try and keep them going even if another charity is doing a better job. The so-called warm glow effect that you get from doing things via your own charity outweighs the original motivation of doing good. So, you will only set up a donkey sanctuary if you really care about looking after donkeys. But will you ever close down your donkey sanctuary voluntarily if on all objective measures the sanctuary down the road is doing a better job? It's unsurprising then that mergers, never easy in any sector, are particularly rare in the charity sector. Without incentives to maximise value, in this case social value, it's not hard to see why mergers rarely come to pass. At the other end of the life cycle, it is fairly straightforward to launch a charity. There are few barriers to entry and often little need for much start-up capital. There is often less due diligence than a business start-up would get from a potential lender. So, if someone is happy to give you the money, you're basically good to go. It then becomes harder to scale up for a whole set of reasons, so charities often operate below optimal size. One knock-on effect is that the bigger players have little reason to fear being pushed out by a bold new entrant in the way that the arrival of Microsoft forced IBM to completely transform. This guides the argument that at a sector level, we waste resources in aggregate because we have too many small charities. Of course, this needs to be set against the power of smaller charities, voluntary and community groups in dealing with specific issues, creating social capital, and securing the full commitment of their staff and supporters. But the basic point still stands. Competition of the traditional neoclassical kind does not help us much in this sector. So if these mechanisms do not work, are we rescued by governance? Well, here we come to a fourth issue. Governance in charities works in a very different way to other sectors. Questions about how the charity is performing and improving often get ignored in favour of topics which feel more urgent. What do our spreadsheets show us about the next month? Does our spend all come within Charity Commission guidelines? Are we financially sustainable? Add to this the voluntary, unpaid nature of trustee positions and the often unclear metrics around good performance, and the net result is that there is usually little pressure from the trustees of a charity or of a charitable funder to be high up what economists call the production possibility frontier, or to be pushing the boundaries on innovation. The fifth systemic problem underpinning a number of these other issues is that it is very hard to assess productivity in this sector. We do not have, and probably cannot have, an agreed measure of output akin to profitability, earnings per share, or even GDP in the private sector. This lack of an agreed numeraire or metric is a major problem, and one I will return to. Finally, and as a consequence of some of the factors already mentioned, collaboration is almost viscerally discouraged. This makes the sector much less productive than it could be overall. Most social issues are stubborn and complex, and finding a solution requires scale and concerted action from different groups working together. This means collaboration among charities and funders, yet we see very little of this in practice. The intense competition for resources creates pressures to bilateral relationships between funders and charities, and therefore a reduced appetite for comparative assessments and cooperation. I've explained a number of barriers to productivity and innovation. So, what is our response? One is, of course, to give up on this quest, maybe even to say that we do not care. The sector is about plurality, giving voice to marginalised people, the glue of civil society. It's about passionate people doing things of their own volition, outside the clutches either of the state or private for-profit interests. Surely charities have a right to exist, and for funders to bankroll them. As long as they do not cause harm, they should be left alone to act as they like. And in any case, when all is said and done, the sector is a bit marginal and nice to have, and we should not beat ourselves up about its weaknesses. But this easy answer is unacceptable. Of course, the overall productivity of the charitable sector includes many things, going beyond the easily measurable aggregate impact of each charity. But this is not an excuse for each organisation to be less productive than it could be. I don't accept that there is a necessary trade-off. The passion that is core to charitable works does not disappear just because we try and work as well as we can. And the need is more urgent just now. As the state pulls back, for good and bad reasons, from helping some of the most vulnerable in society, as well as funding some of the more peripheral areas of life like the arts and sport, the voluntary sector must deliver as much as it can with limited resources. In addition, we must not forget that many charities and community groups receive public money, not only directly, but through important tax advantages. This carries responsibilities. Resources are being given to the sector, and we owe it to the public to use these resources in the best way possible. So the search for doing better must be a priority. Although I now work in the charity sector with MPC, I have experience thinking about these issues in other sectors, and I want to consider if any of this can help us. Let me start with what drives private sector productivity and innovation, something I thought long and hard about, especially in my years running the economics team at think tank IPPR, and then as a special advisor at the Department of Trade and Industry. First, the dynamics of the market dictate that the best companies generally rise to the top. It's hard to hide behind poor performance. If you rest on your laurels, refuse to innovate, do not take up the latest technology, or respond to the changing tastes of your customers and clients, or price keenly for what you produce, then someone else will take your place. You may begin by losing or gaining market share, but this will ultimately lead to what economists call entry and exit. In general, the worst firms leave the market, go bust in normal language, while new ones replace them. To put this another way, if you want to know why no one goes to Wimpy anymore, look no further than McDonald's and Gourmet Burger. Work by Jonathan Haskell at Imperial College shows that this is incredibly important for productivity. It's not just about the weak leaving in a sort of Darwinian X-factor way, but to do with the fact that productivity is often developed by bold new entrants who smash the previous paradigm by bringing in new approaches and new innovations. These are the cutting-edge startups we should want to see coming through, the charities with big ideas and a commitment to measuring how well they are doing and publicly sharing their knowledge of what works and what doesn't. Second, shareholders put their money at risk and want to see a good financial return, so they have strong incentives to push the firm as far as it can go. And finally, all firms operate according to a general infrastructure, by which I mean education, training, physical infrastructure, often provided by or enabled by the public sector, but also agreed and policed standards, metrics, and regulatory structures. All these elements, external to the firm itself, give the right signals and enable innovation. This is all hard stuff to reproduce in the non-profit sector. One answer is to say that we need charities and others to behave more like their private sector counterparts. This explains why some are attracted to more commercial segments of the sector, social enterprise, social and impact investing, and for-profits with a social purpose. Here, we have different governance structures and encounter more of a commercial mindset, which means that, on the whole, they are better on risk, more customer-facing, and often take loan or quasi-equity type funding, which they have to pay back, bringing an element of discipline lacking when funding is via pure grants. The question still answered is whether social enterprises and the like are really an alternative to for-profit outfits and not an alternative to charities. I'll leave that thought hanging. So instead of capitulating to it, let's see what we can draw from the private sector experience. I previously mentioned that infrastructure matters in the private sector and that government sees a role for itself in helping. It would be nice if it did that in the voluntary sector too. A few grants and capacity building projects here and there don't go very far. In government, the business department and the Treasury worry about private sector productivity endlessly, while academics probe for better insights and ideas for action. There is a similar concern for public sector productivity, but also almost nobody really cares about it in the charity sector. More profoundly, the private sector dynamic works partly because there is an ability to compare firms and their products and services and allocate resource accordingly, whether you're a consumer or an investor. In the charity sector, the inability to know much about productivity and other metrics that allow you to see how a charity is doing is inevitably a great stumbling block. At its worst, charities have little or no idea of the effect they are having on the people they exist to help. Given the lack of internal forces pushing towards productivity, the concept of impact has grown up in the charity sector to try and provide grit to those looking to put productivity centre stage. Impact is not productivity, but it acts as a kind of proxy because it focuses on results and so allows you to work out the cost per unit of impact. Impact at the level of the individual charity starts, or should start in MPC's view, with what is known as a theory of change, a process of backwards mapping from your ultimate goal to the outcomes and activities needed to achieve it. After this, you can start to get a handle on how to measure what you achieve. This may start with the outputs you produce along the way, although not outcomes per se. Even counting this can be a big step forward for many, many charities. Measuring softer outcomes becomes harder still, but you can usually have a go. And even if you're an advocacy or campaigning organisation, it still makes sense to think about what doing a good job would look like and measuring yourself against that. Then there are issues around how much you actually contribute towards that outcome. This introduces the language of attribution, additionality, deadweight, displacement, and substitution. Purists say you can only address any of this with top-of-the-range methodology, copied from the medical world, randomised controlled trials, or RCTs. But these are not only expensive and often disproportionate, but can only get you so far in social policy. While a beautifully proven pill that works in one setting will probably work in another, an intervention for loneliness that works for a retired urban professional may well not work for a retired rural farm labourer. When you've assessed your impact, it becomes possible to look at trends across time and compare across different settings, youth clubs, schools, towns, cities, prisons, and against other interventions and organisations. And all of this is vital to any charity that seeks to do better. If you don't know how you're doing and how this is changing over time, you can never learn or improve. But it also starts to allow the external pressures that exist in the private sector to play some sort of role in the non-profit sector. Much of this work is up to the sector itself. Charities need to up their game when it comes to the measurement agenda and act on what it tells them, even when tough to stomach and resisted, as it will be, by trustees, volunteers, funders, and even some of the user group. But so too do charitable foundations and their representative bodies, plus the philanthropy advisors in private banks, in accountancy, and in legal firms. And if funders insisted on more impact measurement and made funding decisions based on whether a charity was at its best in class or was improving, then we would have a mechanism that drove productivity and effectiveness. Certainly there are, and always will be, funders who want to do minimal checking and give money out in a reactive way. But many are at least asking the questions, and at times even helping to support evaluation work. But government can also help press the case for decent measurement. It can support work to proselytise for impact measurement. It's already done this with the Inspiring Impact programme, where MPC leads a wide-ranging group of sector bodies, building support for and tools to enable good impact measurement. And for the G8, or is it now G7, Impact Investing Task Force work on measurement of social impact. A first stab at trying to draw up some international norms, which MPC are deeply involved in. More indirectly, government can insist on some kind of impact measurement as it gives out money. And it can open up its warehouse of data to the charity sector to help them find out what happened to those they work with. Or even more excitingly, create a control group. The work we've done to help launch the Ministry of Justice's Excellent Justice Data Lab is world-leading in this respect and may turn out to be more fruitful and important than the plethora of what work centres the government is currently encouraging. Government and other funders must also think about how their own activities, including their commissioning practices, affect the ability of individual charities and the system to have impact. I think it would be a salutary kick up the pants if they were required to publish a report on how they tried to do this each year. So there are steps we can take with concerted effort from charitable funders, commissioners, data holders, the evaluation community, and from government to make impact measurement the norm. This would undoubtedly drive improvement in the sector. What might we then learn from the public sector in our quest for improving the charitable sphere? Nothing, you may think, since its record on productivity and innovation is not always sterling. Anyone who's worked in public services knows the danger of admitting this to their barber or hairdresser. A litany of complaints about bus times and post office queues soon follows. But this is unfair and unhelpful. I've been intrigued and frustrated by public sector productivity as I've worked across a whole range of services from schools to transport, including in my spell in Downing Street. Here, the drivers of productivity, innovation and progress are closer to those in the charity sector, since the main ways have to be non-market. First, in public services, a number of incentives stem from democratic accountability. Politicians at a local and national level do, in my experience, genuinely want to make services better for citizens and do so cost effectively. They also know that if they do not, they're at risk of being turfed out by the electorate. The charity sector cannot copy this straight, but it could improve its governance by putting its aim to improve services cost effectively up in lights and by having better links with user groups. The Charity Commission could help push trustees in this direction too by demanding more information and making clear that improvement is part of their role. In the public sector, faith has rightly been put in the so-called public service ethos, the belief that those working in the public sector just want to do good. Over the years, however, people have become suspicious. Was it powerful enough? Did all public sector workers really have a selfless desire to do good? Did they not often put the needs of themselves, the producers of the service, above those of the users? So, with waning faith in the idea that services would naturally improve through internal pressures, a number of different elements came in to drive improvement, innovation, modernisation and productivity. One is the attempt at benchmarking, which allows some comparison of cost per unit or of user satisfaction across organisations and activities, either informally or through mechanisms like the now scrapped Audit Commission. There seems little reason in either principle or practice not to apply a similar approach to the charity sector. More dirigiste were the top-down approaches, which encouraged public services to get better through targets, with rewards for hitting them and so on. I think there is something we can learn from this too. One of the more attractive top-down approaches I've long thought about would be a star rating system to help drive what I call competition for esteem. Let me outline my thinking. Several times in my career, I worked on versions of assessment and league tables. They were not always popular with those subjected to them, and involved arguments about whether they measured the right thing, did so accurately, and took into account all of the relevant factors. But more interesting is the way they work to drive improvement and innovation. League tables and tough Ofsted inspections and reports introduced for schools were coupled with greater choice mechanisms and a view that parents could use the data to decide where to send their children. With money following pupils, you had a quasi-market system all ready to go. And while on the margin there was some of this, the strongest effect was on heads and governing bodies and their pride. They did not want to slip down the league table or to have to face colleagues judged better than them. It was a real driver and had real effects, perhaps the ultimate nudge approach. Of course, it sometimes went further than a nudge, with heads likely to face the chop for failing. But the mechanism of comparison did drive the system and achieved it through the effects it had on providers and bosses rather than through consumers and users responding to what the comparisons showed. Either way, as analysis by Professor Gwyn Bevan and colleagues at LSE shows, it certainly seemed to work to raise standards. The comprehensive performance assessment to establish a star rating system for local councils worked in a similar way. It was not that citizens voted on the basis of whether their council got a 1 or a 3-star rating, but the chief execs and councillors did not like to be worse than their peers. Chief execs were sacked if they failed, and those who had achieved 3 stars elsewhere were bought, much like star footballers. It all went crazy for a while councils tried to sort out the Gianfranco Zolas from the Eric Jemba Jembas. Clearly, things are not exactly the same in the charity sector, but the lesson is that forcing greater comparison between charities on the basis of impact is likely to be a good thing, even if not entirely perfect, as it helps create competition for esteem. And to buttress that, we also need some sort of impact leadership group to show the way, create a bit of competition, and put implicit peer pressure on non-performing boards and CEOs. Another way to sharpen our focus on productivity and outcomes in the public sector relates to contracts. Separating the purchaser and the provider, even where both are from the public sector, and having an explicit contract between them was used to force efficiencies and other desirable outcomes. The ultimate end of this approach is the more recent move to payment by results, so that outcomes are specified and providers are pushed to compete over who can provide these outcomes most efficiently. This kind of approach is starting to have some impact on charities and other non-profits, especially those involved in public sector delivery. Despite the many dangers with contracts, and especially payment by results, there is clearly something useful in the focus on outcomes it brings. Social impact bonds may or may not be a big player in the future, but they are at the very least making people think harder about outcomes and working together and managing performance to produce those outcomes. And social investment and impact investing is related to all this too, since the aim is to take a reduced financial return because you're looking to achieve a social return. Exactly how much most social investors are really going to be focused on the precise achievement of social goals rather than the financial part is a matter that is now starting to be debated. Finally, in public services, it is clear that everyone needs to work together if we are to achieve outcomes, however hard joined-up government proves to be. This is very different from the private sector, where, broadly, each individual firm doing the best it can on its own leads to the best outcome overall. The charity sector is much more like the public than the private sphere on this dimension, so it's vital that the search for impact does not stop at the doors of a particular charity. The real aim is the impact we achieve overall, and whether we can learn, improve, and scale up. This means using collective theories of change for a whole area of work, common metrics and approaches, sharing information about evaluation on what works as well as what doesn't, and collaborating and working together. So, while driving productivity in the non-profit sector is a challenge, I've suggested some ways we can go forward. Impact measurement, competition for Esteem, more collaboration, more pressure and support from the sector itself and from government, all would help. The charity sector will never be like other sectors. Indeed, its special role means we don't want it to be. But if we can get 20 or even just 10% more out of the sector by doing what we already know better, and even more if we can get innovation motoring, then the world would be a better place. It only needs 10% of charities to step it up a bit, and suddenly 16,000 organisations are better equipped to help their beneficiaries, bring in new ideas, innovate to survive. That's likely to help hundreds of thousands of people who rely on those charities. And that's the effect of just 1 in 10 improving. And that is surely something worth fighting for. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, I don't think anyone, Dan, can accuse you of not being provocative. There's a huge amount there. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, but before that, I'm delighted to bring in our two respondents. To remind you, Lucy de Groot, Chief Executive of Community Service Volunteers, and Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Lucy, I'm sure you could speak for a long time, but I'm going to ask you to restrict your comments to 5 or 6 minutes. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to respond. I'm probably not going to be quite as critical as, I don't know if you're looking for blood on the platform, but I don't think you're going to get that. But I hope, I probably agree with, over 85% of what Dan said. But I just want to kind of explore some of the areas that I think worth thinking about from a slightly different perspective. I've had many years in the community sector, in local government and central government, and I ran the Improvement Agency for Local Government for 6 years. So I'm now the Chief Executive of an organisation that's just celebrated 50 years, but was, of course, set up by exactly one of these social innovators. So the man who set up a CSV 50 plus years ago, also prior to that, just set up VSO. So Dr. Alec Dixon was a kind of, in our modern jargon, he was the ultimate social entrepreneur. One of the interesting things about taking over an organisation that had been going for this long and indeed had had a very stable, if that's the right phrase, senior management, so the same person had been chief exec before I was there for 48 years, is you learn a number of things about change and innovation and culture, which are quite interesting. So I just want to say something about why I chose rather late in my career to work in the charity sector. And that's because of the actual fundamental importance, in my view, in a robust democracy of a strong civil society voice. And that's why I think what Dan's saying is so important, because I think a strong civil society voice is about a voice that is actually accountable in its own way as well. So I think you need a very strong representative democracy, but you also need participative democracy to have a really dynamic society. And I suppose that's why I think this debate matters. Firstly want to kind of slightly quibble with Dan's notion of the charity sector. He's focused on what you might call traditional charities, but of course what's the fascinating phenomenon at the moment is that nearly everything that moves, that the government is trying to move out of the public sector, is actually being turned into a charity. And I think that raises some very interesting questions, and some of us need to be a bit challenging about that, and I could wax lyrical about that, but I think it's an important point to make. Secondly, I think that a lot of us think that the not-for-profit concept is actually not terribly helpful. I'm absolutely clear in my organisation that we have to make a surplus. Without a surplus, and it's the fact that we weren't making a surplus when I took it over that meant I've had to do a major transformation job. Without a surplus, you can't invest in your people, you can't invest in systems, you can't invest in a sustainable future. So I think there's a real problem if we think that profit is, the language of profit may not be the right one, but you absolutely have to have a surplus. And that is quite challenging for a lot of people in the sector. I think the next point I want to make is that I think absolutely no charity, like any other organisation, has the right to exist per se. You only have a right to exist because you deliver against your charitable objectives. And we continually as organisations need to be clear about that. And I think some of the work on impact and so on is absolutely crucial to all of that. But I think the kind of clarity about what your charitable objectives are and are they still relevant to the changing world and are you actually achieving them is really, really important. I want to say something a bit about productivity because obviously that's the heart of Dan's analysis. I think that it's one of those things, it's a bit like motherhood, isn't it? Productivity is clearly a good thing. Doing more better with the resources you've got must be a good thing. But I think we have to recognise, and I've had a lot of experience of this in some areas of the public sector, and I think the debate about how you measure productivity in the public sector is deeply unresolved as a non-economist on this platform. There is a classic example in children's in child protection, which I just want to kind of share with you, because I think it shows how you need to think about a whole system approach, which is child protection is classically been in crisis, particularly brought to the fore by the Victoria Climbié tragedy. And one of the key answers that came out of all this is it's not the numbers of children that you see, it's the outcomes and the ways in which you can actually work with their children, those families, to get a better and safer answer. And Eileen Munro's report, which I think is seminal in this area, which came out it's one of the greatest things this government did when it first came in my personal view, in terms of policy, was very clear that what you need to look at is the whole system. And I think you can talk about whole system productivity, but you are then getting to quite a sophisticated view of the world. So I just say, let's not be too crude about what our notions of productivity is. I mean, one of the things is you probably do need more and better qualified social workers who are better supervised and whose judgment is actually sound. I suppose my other point would be about comparisons with sectors. I think, if I was going to be honest, I think your comparisons in relation to the private sector, perhaps because I know slightly less about it, are slightly more powerful than the ones in the public sector. But I would also say, as we look around the private sector, those of us who consume lots of it all the time, it's not like a kind of bowl of roses, is it? I mean, I don't actually feel in relation to utilities or in relation to my telecoms or indeed the private housing market that it's actually one where consumers are getting a particularly good deal at the moment. So I think there's some issues around all of that. I think the point you make about externalities is absolutely crucial. And once you get into that, whether you talk about regulation, whether you talk about rules, whether you talk about expectations, whether you talk about public and political pressure, those things I absolutely think are ones that are really important for the charity sector as well. And then the whole question of sort of impact. Is it the Holy Grail? Well, obviously, if you're at MPC, and we've worked with MPC, it absolutely is the Holy Grail. No, I mean, to be honest, it is, I think the whole notion of, and I just showed Dan beforehand our little theories of change that we have for our 4 or 5 key beneficiary groups at CSV. I think the whole notion of theories of change and impact models are really, really powerful. And for me, it goes back to what I was doing 15, 20 years ago in the public sector, particularly in local government, which was competitive tendering. And one of the things that we were doing in the 80s, when competitive tendering was introduced into local government compulsorily, was to say, let's not just get obsessed about the contracts. Let's actually decide what is the service that we want to provide. And indeed, in the early 80s, there were a few challenges financially in those days, those of you who are old enough to remember it. What actually can we afford to provide, and in what way should we do that? So that absolute notion, deconstructing What is it you're trying to do? Who is it you're trying to do it with? And what are the resources you need, including, of course, we would say in civil society, the resources of people themselves. And I think that's the other issue we really need to think about. So there are some, I suppose my other final strand would be to say that it's important that at the same time as being critical and self-critical as a sector, we also learn better how to celebrate what is going on and some of the really exciting and important work that is developing. And I just want to pick up two things. One is there's quite a lot of work going on around the sort of area which I'm particularly concerned about, which is what is the impact of social action and volunteering on the kinds of well-being outcomes that we're all associated with. You touched on loneliness, there's the whole issue of mental health, there's the whole issue of people with long-term conditions and their ability to kind of survive with a better outcome, and a whole number of other areas we could talk about. But I think the whole redesign, reconstruction of public services where citizens become much more central, I absolutely do believe, not that just civil society and charities have a role to play, but I think civil society and charities in particular have a really important role to play. So I suppose my call to action would be this. I think let's focus on impact and increasing well-being. Let's learn how to share, to measure and to analyse. And there are some tensions. The sharing and the competition, let's be honest, don't go brilliantly well together. Let's drive improvement and recognise that it's a journey, not a destination. You need to continually be thinking where you want to be going next with the changing and difficult world we're all in. Let's use productivity and innovation as concepts where they're relevant. And let's learn how to learn. I think there's a real issue about how do we become more open to learning? How do we actually, and that's true for even the people who kind of think they're innovating, you know, what was yesterday's innovation becomes today's, you know, boring practice, and tomorrow's, you know, yesterday has been. But equally, some of the things that are described as innovation, because they get, by getting the label innovation, you get the money, and there's a whole number of people who give out money if you call yourself innovation, are actually just redescribing things that have been going on for 20, 50, 100, thousands of years. Nothing wrong with that, as long as we don't become disingenuous about what it is that's actually new. And finally, let's challenge ourselves and others, and that's the thing I really did like in Dan's piece, which is we do need to challenge, in the best sense of the word, challenge funders, the whole thing about core costs and the nature of investment, as I've tried to say, and government and indeed the private and the public sector. So we need to challenge ourselves and others to aspire for the best possible outcomes for the investment of time and energy and money. So, as we say in my charity, we really do want to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I actually happen to know that Lucy prepared a response which was 5 times as long as that. I do hope you're going to give your full response to Dan so that he can see what you would have said if we'd had half an hour rather than 5 minutes. Also, I should point out to you, because you couldn't have seen because you were looking down at your notes, but there was a discernible age difference in response to your point about most innovation is actually being done lots and lots and lots of times. Everyone over the age of 45 started nodding their heads, and everyone under 45 didn't know what you were talking about. Fortunately, we're a good age spread in this room.
Oh, absolutely. You're a mere child, Matthew.
So, Vicky.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. I used to work with Dan for a while, and I worked both in the public and the private sector. I happen now to also be patron of a number of charities, so I've discovered quite a lot about how they run. In addition, of course, I was for a while trustee at the RSA, so I have some experience in this, but in particular, the reason why Dan asked me to be on this is because I used to be in charge of productivity for the UK economy, which is a nightmare if you think about it. It's a sort of thing that would keep you awake at night. When I used to work for the government, when the Labour Party had the Labour government had those PSA targets, public service agreements, there was some unfortunate person who was the senior responsible officer in charge of this, and I was the one for productivity, PSA 1. The public sector was excluded, which is fantastically good because we couldn't measure it. Just as Lucy was saying, we still can't measure it. And I think that's very, very, very unfortunate because, of course, it touches on what the charities do as well. And I think what's really interesting, if you listen to Dan trying to learn lessons from either the private or the public sector, I think what the charities do have in common, or certainly the third sector, let's say, has in common with the private sector, which isn't fantastic, is that basically it depends on short-term funding and is quite unable to do sort of long-term planning and of course check what has happened to the policies that they have managed to push and implement, or any intervention that they managed to make, whether it's in this country or elsewhere. Because the money has run out, the project's finished, and there's never, almost never, any ability to go back again a year later and see whether whatever's been done has become part of the culture of the place they were working in and really made a difference in the long term, because it could all have been wasted once they withdraw, once that particular project is over. And that's really difficult in terms of trying to calculate any productivity impact at all. But in common with the public sector is the issue that I mentioned before, which is you can't really measure it. I am a great believer in the public sector as it happens. I think that productivity is under-recorded, underestimated, and an awful lot of innovation is taking place that we just don't necessarily see, including, for example, in the NHS. I think that needs to be constantly revised. And as you probably know, the ONS itself, the Office for National Statistics, is right now coming to grips with the fact that it isn't really counting quite a lot of the innovation that takes place in the economy, in our GDP, in the gross domestic product. And it's about to publish new data based on new views on R&D spending and so on, which is going to make quite a big difference to where we are. Now, of course, we think we're there, but we might be somewhere else. Does it make much difference? I think it does, because we want to be looking at various sectors of the economy and various aspects of activity, which we may want to push. So clearly, then, we need to think about the sector in this wider way. I think innovation is important, thinking again about productivity, because it does make a huge difference to the way the economy is run. And what is really important is the spillovers, which Dan mentioned. It's really how the various bits of the economy, whether it's public, private, and the third sector, can learn from each other, where innovation can in fact spread from one area to another. And thinking again about Dan's point about smallness and lots and lots of very small charities around and not enough exodus. The interesting thing is, if you look at the historical perspective, not only from here but from loads of other countries, a number of the big issues of the day that we now consider to be mainstream, such as environment, for example, were all started by small charities pushing for it and really brought it to the surface. Now, of course, those small charities should, in theory, have disappeared. Some have, but different organizations need to take over if the push is to continue. In some cases, of course, there is a sunset clause, like there should be, for example, with some regulators, if the market has, in fact, improved and taken over the whole area of advocacy that was taking place. So we need to bear that in mind. Now, I wanted to just very quickly say that those measurement issues are not just intrinsic ones in terms of how you calculate productivity. They're also a problem because the charity sector or the third sector is so split in terms of the activities of individual organizations. And I think we can split them into 3 or 4. I think the first one is those organizations that push for a cause. Penal reform, for example, about which I know a certain amount. Now, you could argue that those organizations, when you find the productivity very difficult to measure because very little has changed, possibly. But what actually they do is they fill in one very important part of a market failure, which is information. It is only that way that the public understands where the issues are, and they can vote democratically the next time around, whatever the issue may be, because they have a lot more information which is coming through this way. So they do have a role to play, but the productivity isn't measured properly across the economy, and yet they're very significant. So they fill that in. The second type are, as an example, those who push for vaccination of children in other countries. And I have spoken to some today, actually, on my way over. I don't mean the children who are being vaccinated. I spoke to the agencies that are involved. And they say, well, it's very difficult because we're an intermediate. It's an intermediate good, if you like. And how can we possibly measure it? Well, you could. As an economist, I would say you can monetize almost everything. Because, of course, you have to put a value to life. And, of course, these children will survive. They wouldn't have done otherwise. And then there's an implication for the growth of the economy as a whole and the people that can support, and et cetera, et cetera. So you could do it, theoretically. So you could, in fact, measure that too. The third one, I suppose generalizing again, is those that actually provide services directly. So those which are likely to be involved now in payment by results, where you have to be capable of calculating the impact that they will have on the areas that they may be involved in. So let's say the work programme, where evaluation is absolutely essential. Now, in all those cases, there is no excuse for not having proper governance, so one is able to do it, the number of people who are able to run the organisation properly, and transparency in terms of what the results are, so the funding can continue in an open way. But all those also owe it to the rest of us who put quite a lot of money into those to ensure that they're doing it in the most productive and transparent way. It is arguable, therefore, that smaller organisations which haven't got the ability to have proper forward planning, proper HR, they have to have financial, of course, which is necessary, or are able to attract the right people to be on their board, may perhaps have very little reason to continue to exist on their own and should perhaps merge. So therefore, I think that Dan has a point there. Very hard to say to the people who are passionate and involved in this, but I think that needs to happen. That's why I think actually looking at it from a productivity perspective along the lines that I just outlined is important. It is a big sector, makes a huge contribution to well-being, possibly, and well-being can be measured, and I think it's often ignored in terms of proper measurement and attribution to what it can actually provide and help the economy with. Thank you.
So Dan, I'm acutely aware of time. We can overrun for kind of 5 minutes or so to 5 past or 10 past, but I want to get questions from the audience. I just have one question for you, which is that I think I told you this, but your predecessor spoke here about 5 or 6 years ago, and he wasn't quite as forensic as you, but he expressed similar levels of pain, I think, about the challenge of getting the sector to be as productive as it could be, to focus on impact, all those things. So I guess the question is simply, do you think things are improving?
Yeah, I sometimes feel when I sort of say some of these things that I sound like I'm being very critical of charities, where I'm a bit more of kind of see the world as a system. And it's the world, as you work, as I've done over the last few years, work very closely with charities and also with funders, you start to see a system which makes it very, very hard to do anything other than what charities do. The way the funding comes through, the incentives to not share. Some of my team get very cross about this thing that Lucy raised about sharing versus competition. So they feel, for instance, if you've had an intervention to, say, reduce reoffending or something like that, and you tried it out and you got it properly evaluated, it turned out it didn't work, that you really should tell the whole world about that very loudly, because we're all trying to reduce reoffending, so you don't want somebody else spending money on something you just found didn't work. But of course, charities tend not to do that because they're very worried they won't get any more funding. So it's the whole system, I think, is the problem. So that's my sort of critique, and that's why I think that it's not a criticism of any particular person in the sector. It's the way the whole system works. Now, I think things have moved on. I mean, I mentioned, for instance, this whole impact agenda, which MPC sort of kicked off many years ago, and is relatively mainstream in the sense that I don't think many people in the sector anymore would say that the concept of impact is a silly one and a stupid one. There's not, by no means all. I mean, there are some people who are very, very hostile to even the concept that a charity should think about really understanding what it's achieving, because it's about the doing, and it's about the passion, and it's about just a bunch of people getting together and doing something that's good. But I think that has changed quite profoundly. We did some survey work a couple of years ago, and it showed most charities said they're trying to do something in this space, however good or bad it is, they are trying. So I think there has been progress. So I think we can be optimistic. But the other wave, and I mentioned it in the speech, and I was in the States recently, there's a lot of excitement there, which is a danger for traditional charity movement, of these kind of much more commercially minded non-profits, whether they're social enterprises or KICs or mutual spin-outs, or they're businesses with a social purpose, whatever exactly that means. Because, I think they are a bit more dynamic and innovative, and I think they may well be the future. If we come back in 20 years' time, we may find that a lot of the social stuff's being done by slightly more entrepreneurial organisations with that kind of governance and financial structure, surviving on loans and things like that rather than just grants. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that's going to happen. So if the charity sector doesn't get its act in order, that's the future.
Great. Let's have a few comments around the room. I can immediately see 4 hands. Let's take those 4. Try and keep your comments brief, if possible, your question brief, and tell us who you are. Yep.
On? Hello. Seamus O'Farrell, run a strategy consultancy called Forward Thinking. My career has basically been running advertising agencies in marketing departments, but I spent 2 years at Prostate Cancer UK rebranding it and very interesting. So I'm not an expert in the charity sector, but something that strikes me about measurement is that lots of charities, and I think what Lucy said about whole system thinking, and also the inability to really do long-term business planning because you just don't have guaranteed revenue streams, is actually sometimes charities have got too far-reaching, highfalutin, we're going to end poverty. No, you're not. We're going to cure cancer. You're not. So maybe what they need to do is focus and be more prioritised and more brutal in the objectives that they can achieve in this year or in 3 years' time, so that actually they don't try and do the whole world, but they do actually set objectives which are going to make a difference, that can be stretching, but that are achievable and therefore measurable.
Great, thank you. Who was next? Yep.
My name's Andy Martin. I run a firm called Firetail. The missing word from that for me was strategy. And the best lesson that maybe charities can learn from the private sector is the having of a strategy, which is locating themselves in the landscape and understanding all those things, because it's a very passionate sector. But surely, if passion and strategy, in the organisations where we work with, they're passionate and strategic, they are productive and innovative. And so for me, that's the sort of, I want to see where that sits in the framework of the way you're thinking about this problem.
Okay, and then behind you.
Hi, Stella Smith. I agree very much with much of what's been said. I think what's missing for me is an understanding of people. I think to say that people in the charity sector are totally motivated by the passion of the charity sector, I think is vastly oversimplifying it. I think if we're going to really make change in the charity sector, we've got to be honest. We've got to really address some of the behaviour that's going on in there, and I think we need some good managers.
When you say the behaviour that's going on in there, what do you mean?
I think that...
Spill the beans. No. But I mean, no, what kind of behaviour? Selfishness, stupidity?
I think if we were really honest, we could all in the charity sector look around us and say there are people who are not doing their jobs properly, there are volunteers that are not doing their jobs properly, there are trustees that are not effective. Okay. We just don't know what to do about them.
Just general crapness. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. But then behind you. It's not past the watershed. Sorry for that. Yeah.
James Plunkett of Social Investment Group. I just wonder whether there's an opportunity for getting the charities that are engaging in the delivery of things like the social impact bonds to put some of their endowed money into the investment in the same way that venture capitalists would follow their clients' money with their own. It would give them not only a distinct need to measure the performance, but they would also benefit from their own good performance. And I don't know whether that's something, Dan, that you've had any discussions or interest in. Seemed like perhaps an opportunity.
So, great questions from James, Stella, Andy, Seamus. Because I want to take one more round of questions, I'm going to restrict your panel to just choosing one of those points that you want to respond to. If you could just choose one and make one quick response to it.
Well, on strategy and planning, they're really linked. You're absolutely right. The long-term planning cannot happen very easily if you have quite short-term funding. But also it's not in the nature of a number of the organisations that I know. But it's quite interesting. I have an anecdote, which is that my daughter worked for a charity, rather a social enterprise. And they were doing amazing stuff, opening things left, right and centre. And they actually won Charity of the Year award. That she was able to help them with. And then she rang me and said, I'm off to Liverpool. We're opening yet another centre for homeless doing blah, blah, and I'm not going to say what because it will be obvious what it is. But there's no planning. We have no idea where the money is going to come from. But we're opening this without any, the building's been acquired. And she was astonished, and I was astonished that this was happening. And of course, the crisis came, and there was no money available any longer for that, and everyone was sacked who was involved in all this. So it just shows, I think, it links actually to the issue of management and governance and what have you. I mean, this thing should not happen without proper scrutiny of everyone because it's someone's money. That allows for this to happen without proper control.
Lucy?
Right, I'm going to cheat. So on the people one, absolutely right. People, you don't suddenly get a halo and grow wings because you work for a charity. And similarly, you don't get horns if you go and work in the private sector. This is a nonsense. I think that there are different motivations that different people have at different points in their lives and all the rest of it. But good management is a bit, I think good business practice, good management is absolutely central. But I think it also links to the first point quickly, which is I absolutely agree with the point about focus and so on. One of the challenges is how you link that to fundraising, as I'm sure you discovered with your very good work on prostate cancer, because Shelter sells itself for many, many years as being the charity that ended homelessness. In fact, Shelter actually does very little on homelessness. It does a lot of lobbying and so on, but actually it gives housing advice to people who, many of whom are not homeless. So there's a kind of, and the same with Cancer UK, they had, and the reason that it's so difficult to do that is not just because people in the charity sector are stupid, it's because actually you're looking at a number of different audiences, and in particular you're looking at the audiences of how do you get the emotional connection in terms of people giving money. So I think we need to understand that there's a tension in the context of what you're trying to operate.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree with Lucy. There is a tension, but it's interesting. We do a lot of, we don't call it, but it's basically strategy consulting for charities. And often it's around, we start off, because we start everything off with a theory of change, because we think, you know, a lot of organisations, charities have got a bit lost as to what it is they're trying to achieve. And so how could they tell at the end of the year they've done a good job? And they've obviously often got very confused, and they'll do something like you say. They'll say, we're going to transform children's lives. And what they're actually doing is helping with catch-up reading at age 6 or something. It's a great thing to do. But whether it's really doing those other things. Then when you've done all that and helped them think through the organisation, there's then a big management issue, because often it means that there's certain projects they've been running that they just picked up because there happened to be a contract going or somebody gave them some money for it. And they really ought to close it down and spend the money on something else, or maybe there's another organisation doing that better. But that is a very, very difficult management challenge. I think it's harder than in the private sector or even the public sector, because you may have volunteers who've been delivering it for years, who can tell you, I transformed lots of people's lives, I can see it. And the fact that somebody did some evaluation and showed that compared to a comparator group, it made no difference, they're not very happy. You might have had funders who funded it. You probably won prizes for it. Charity sector gives out prizes to everybody, quite frankly. It's a bit mad. It's a really difficult... Our work, often the big moment comes is, can the chief exec or the chair of trustees take through this change? And often, you know, unless they're up for it, they can carry on without making those changes and nothing will happen. You couldn't do that in the private sector. You could get away with it a bit in the public sector, but not for that long. In the charity sector, you can do it for a long time. So I think management is even harder in the sector, and there's a real premium on getting good people in.
Very quick last round of questions, because so the gentleman there, and then there's a lady there, and then there's a gentleman at the back. You can see. Yep.
Thank you. My name's Peter Pledger. I used to run a business support organisation for 7 years till it was thankfully taken over by a much larger organisation. My question is about simplifying the private sector, because, Dan, your entire approach was we can learn from the private sector and apply it to the charity sector. And your general approach, I'm with you on, moderated, thankfully, by Lucy's comment. But be careful what you're pointing to. The private sector is not one solid whole. There are thousands of private sector businesses who survive on funding for the next week and then have to work out whether they've got the sales, if they can pay their staff the following week. There are thousands more private sector businesses that are niche businesses that exist on their small base of customers and are happily continuing and have no intention of growing or changing. The examples of that, on every high street you'll see tiny accountants with 20, 30, 40 customers, and they're not going to move anywhere. That's the private sector. Yes, you have Google, yes, you have others, but be careful. The diversity of the private sector is in fact mirrored by the charity sector, and I think that diversity is quite a good thing.
Good point. Yep.
Hello.
Yep, it's working.
It is? Okay. My name is Jane Bravery. I'm not in the charity sector, but I did intern, albeit at a later stage in life, for a year. And I just felt that perhaps it was a closed shop, and innovation, productivity, and people from the outside, from the private sector, were not really welcome. And I'm wondering if somebody can answer that for me. I'm going to have a drink afterwards. I'd like people to tell me, because everywhere I go, people say to me, oh, you'll never get into the charity sector, it won't work. Yeah, so, and this comes from recruitment agencies and quite a few people. So perhaps somebody can enlighten me on that. Thank you.
It may be that you get your career counselling in the drinks rather than from the stage, but then back of the room.
My name's Kevin Munder. I run a social impact bond funded programme called Think Forward that's incubated inside Impetus, a private equity foundation. And because of the social impact bond, we're very focused on impact. But it took hundreds of hours of pro bono support to create the deal. The outcomes framed by our commissioner aren't really long-term outcomes for the young people that we want to support. And frankly, the outcome payments aren't enough to cover really the theory of change that we think that they need. So how do we do impact investing in a way that's really accessible for most charities?
Very good. Okay, panel, you can either respond to any of those points, which are very interesting, or you can just make one other killer point that you want to make just to close the end of the session. Vicky, your final paragraph.
Me again?
Well, no, okay, I'll start. No, fair enough, I'll go to you second, but Dan's got to have the final word. Right, Lucy.
Okay, I'm going to answer the private sector point, and more generally, I'm very happy to give you career counselling if I could be any help, but I've moved sectors through my career, and there's two things about it. One is people say it's great because you've got a varied background, and in other cases people say, well, you don't understand because you come from somewhere different. And I think that, to be honest, that's true in all numbers of sectors, so I think we just need to accept that. I would also say, having for kind of rather late in my career, I've been very involved in charities, but for the first time actually running a medium-sized charity, would say that a lot of what you say actually is true, that there's quite a lot of kind of cloning and inward-looking and all the rest of it. Having said that, I have a management team of 4, 2 of whom I have to say, it's all women at the moment, and 2 of whom have come entirely from the private sector. And they are both shell-shocked and horrified by some of the things that are going on at a whole number of different levels, including the accountability to trustees. At the same time, they've brought enormous energy and enthusiasm and expertise and issues about productivity and business management and all the rest of it. And I think, if I'm honest, we've got a lot from them, but also I think they've taken a lot from it, and I hope to say. So there's hope.
Reminds me, I have to say, sorry, but reminds me of someone I know went to teach in a school, and I said, what was it like after a couple of years from the private sector? And they said, teachers work really, really, really hard. We said the really weird thing about teachers is they think everybody else goes to work at 9 and comes home at 5.
Yeah.
They don't understand that anybody else works in the evenings or weekends. Yeah. So they work really, really hard, but they've a really odd view of how everybody else lives their lives. So I thought it was a very interesting reflection. Vicky.
It's quite interesting what Lucy just said there about the board or the trustees that you're using, because what I have heard from the organisations I've been involved in, that they do go out and find the right people to be on their board, to be trustees. And when they come, even though they may be experts in economics or experts in accounting, they come and ask different questions. They become different people when they're in the charity, because it's a different world, and they find it actually quite hard to use their skills. So there needs to be a bit of training. I mean, whoever wants to get into the charity business and do some training for people coming on the boards, that would be quite useful. That probably already exists. But of course, the Charity Commission has all sorts of suggestions on how to have a proper board, but it's how to put it in practice, which is an issue. The pro bono issue, which was mentioned at the back, which I think is quite a good point. I mean, that has surprised me as well, how much time and effort there needs to be to get anything moving and actually put into practice. And as some people here know, there are a number of pro bono organisations out there who spend all their time working with charities to improve their business acumen, if you like, their marketing, and quite a lot of evaluation. I'm patron of something called Pro Bono Economics, which has done tons of those evaluations for organisations to see whether they can prove that they're worth it, if you like, for bidding or not. And the amount of hours I have to go into this is enormous. I just can't think how the system can change to any significant extent, because unless the fund, whoever puts the money in, needs to understand that a lot of what needs to happen up front needs to be paid for somehow. The idea that you can always find the right pro bono people, that usually people who have the time. I mean, in our case, of course, lots of economists prepared to do it, but it's very lucky that this thing has been set up and it's happening. But otherwise, there just isn't the understanding of the amount of the effort that needs, the upfront investment that needs to go into this, which, of course, might have stopped any private organisation from entering a particular sphere. And I think that is one of the differences that exists between private and public, which I think we need to... yes, private and public, of course, but also private and charities.
I'm always tempted by the kind of Mrs. Merton question about why charities choose trustees. Why did you choose that millionaire businessman to be on your board? Dan?
Yeah, just kind of closing comments. I mean, I think it's a very important time for the non-profit sector. I think that at the moment we've got a reconfiguration going on between the state and the private sector and civil society. And civil society is going to have to play a bigger role. I think, whether we like it or not, I think it's a good thing it is as well. But in that context, these kind of questions I've been trying to raise tonight, which is, are we doing as well as we can? Does the governance work? Does the funding systems work? If you put the whole thing together, does it mean civil society is doing everything it can do? I think that's a really a very important question. It needs to be much higher up the agenda now. And so I hope I've at least provoked some debate and some thought tonight.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going home in a few minutes to think about my theory of change, in case Dan comes knocking. I'm delighted to say that you can continue this conversation. I get the sense people do want to continue the conversation by going to the room immediately below this, where we have a drinks reception, which is kindly donated to us by Odgers Bernsten. Have I pronounced that right, the second bit? Odgers Bernsten, thank you. Bernsten, okay, good. It would be very impolite of me not to pronounce it correctly, but thank you very much for doing it. So do go downstairs, have a drink, but most of all, can I ask you to, before you do that, to thank our panel, Lucy and Vicky, but particularly our speaker, Dan Corry. Thank you.